Yeah, so I was a committed Islamist for 20 years. A very well-intentioned Muslim extremist, but an extremist nevertheless. So when I say I was a Muslim extremist, what I mean is I had a very puritanical view of religion itself, Islam, because that was my family background. My parents are from that Salafi tradition, which in itself is not necessarily bad. My parents and their families were a very spiritual, austere, ascetic kind of Islam which they had, which I think actually has lots of strength to it. But the big problem with Salafis, who are Muslim Puritans, if you like, is that they try to impose that Puritanism on the whole of society. And what that leads to is a kind of deep hatred of society, because if most of society doesn't live up to your very pure moral standards, then the devil intervenes and subverts that kind of piety into looking down on other people and being arrogant and saying, well, they're not as good as you. In Salafi circles, there is a strong sense that they are the only true Muslims. And this is true of all religious sects, actually. They believe they are the true believers and everybody else is going to hell because they're not good enough. So Salafis generally have that view of other Muslims, especially Sufis and Shiites. So that's on the religious side. And then there's the religion plus politics, which is where excessively political Islam, or what we call Islamism, comes in. They split the world into Islam versus non-Islam, Muslims versus non-Muslims, Islam versus the West. A lot of that is kind of fascist talk. It's a kind of fascist version of Islam. And it was the norm. It was something you actually never questioned. You never questioned the fact that our mission was to convert the whole world to Islam. And not only convert individuals, but if they had the choice not to convert to Islam, but they certainly had no choice in that an Islamic state was going to be forced upon them, and then Muslims had no other option but to work for this kind of vision. One of the biggest reasons why that vision was so appealing to me as a young person was I grew up in 80s London and experienced a lot of racism growing up. Britain was a far more racist place, I think, in the 1980s, certainly London was. And racist insults and terms were an everyday occurrence. So at school, even the good kids at school, who I was good friends with at primary school especially, regularly and routinely used racist terminology about black people, Asian people, Chinese people. And I experienced racism. Most Pakistanis or people of Pakistani origin, as we were, experienced that, not only at school but on the streets, threatening behaviour, even being attacked occasionally, seeing your parents and members of your family being spat upon, having alcohol thrown at them, or being verbally abused in public. I remember, probably at the age of 10, witnessing my mum being subjected to racist abuse by a ticket inspector on the Underground, on the London Underground tube system, because she didn't have the right ticket. And unfortunately, that increased this perception that somehow white people were all racist, really, or British people were actually all racist, even though they'd be nice to you, to your face. Even though, teachers, etc. at school, and most of the kids were very nice. My parents came here with very good intentions in the late 70s to Britain, but didn't really understand Britain, didn't understand the European white kind of culture, because they were from a very religious, devout kind of Puritan world from India, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And they actually kept us isolated and sheltered from the wider British society, because they felt, they genuinely believed that Western social values and moral values were non-existent, or this was a morally corrupt society, and they had to preserve their family, including us, the children, in a kind of pure Muslim state, and not allow us to be corrupted by that kind of society. Now, all those tensions that produces a big identity crisis for a start, but also a lot of fear. I mean, we genuinely used to be in fear, travelling on our own, for example, as children or as teenagers, or even as families, as a family going out to theme parks or picnics and things. And so when in my teenagers, I came across a Salafi group which asserted a kind of Muslim power. It said, we are proud of being Muslims, and we are going to assert that power by saying very clearly that our religion is superior to every other religion, plus we will propagate this and we will fight for it. We will be militants as well. We will defend it. We will propagate it, and one day we will conquer Britain and conquer the world for an Islamic state. For me, it spent probably a good 10 years being felt marginalised and somebody who was always going to be subjected to racist harassment, etc. It was incredibly liberating to be part of that group and to feel protected and defended, and was also working towards a noble aim, which was establishing Islam around the world, if you like. Our activism was very faith-centred, actually, and it was more driven by a well-intentioned concern for human souls. It was about salvation, about saving people. Practically speaking, people who had come from broken homes, for example, or who had some kind of vacuum in their life and needed some kind of support, were probably more likely to come and listen to you and get involved with the group. Because, as I said, there was a strong feeling of cohesiveness within the group feeling of being the brotherhood and the sisterhood was very important, and a lot of people found solace and comfort in that. I remember one of the TV documentaries we watched in our group was about militant Islam, and it ended with the words of one of the Egyptian jihadis who was part of the group that assassinated Sadat. And he actually said, Islam grows and thrives on the blood of martyrs, and it will one day lead the world. For Islamists like ourselves, it was actually very edifying words, thinking, wow, he said it, he's told them the truth. Our group was originally called Harakatu Islahi Shabab al-Muslim, which was the movement to reform the Muslim youth, and then its name changed to Jamiat Ihya Minhaj Sunnah, which was the society to revive the way of the Messenger of God. So as I said, a very kind of puritanical approach to Islam. It did set up the Salafi movement in Britain, which has now splintered and fragmented into many groups, some of which have become very extreme and continue to become so, and they've had overlaps with Salafi jihadism as well, which had led to a lot of jihadi activity, including terrorist activity, unfortunately. But there was a kind of mothership of that in the 80s, was our group. And although the founder of that group was largely Abu Muntasir, a charismatic young devout Muslim leader, probably in his mid-20s, who spoke very well to young people because he was pretty young himself, and he spoke from the heart, and that attracted a lot of people. Rather than just talking about it, as we saw the other groups, Hizb ut-Tahrir and Tabligh Jamaat and the Brotherhood people doing, he had the courage of his convictions and made contacts with groups carrying out jihad in places like Afghanistan, Kashmir and Burma, and went out there physically to join the jihad and actually fought on the front line. And in one of those episodes, I was able to join him in 1990 to spend a week at a training camp in Afghanistan, an Arab training camp in Kunar in eastern Afghanistan, and a day and night at the front line fighting the Afghan communist troops. So they allowed us as a special exemption to go to the front line after just 1 week's training. We spent a day and night at the front line, firing heavy artillery at the communist positions. This was 76mm cannon, really, really long. And it was an exhilarating experience, I have to say. When you're 19 and you're essentially a bookworm like me, very academically minded, somebody who just loves his books and sitting in a library or just reading books all day, to be transported into the incredibly beautiful mountains of Afghanistan in the middle of a war was absolutely exhilarating. A real adventure, a real high, which you never forget. But I have to say, I look back on that and realise many years later that we were caught up in a civil war, basically, and in the kind of massive international geopolitics with the Cold War and the Soviet Union and the various Afghan groups, and then the political Islam thrown into the mix of the call for jihad. But once I've realised, a lot of that teaching was wrong, well-intentioned, but very wrong. I hope we never killed anyone, because we fired those shells at Afghan communist positions who were maybe 3 or 5 miles away over other mountain ranges. We had no idea whether our shells landed on them or not. When I talk about Afghanistan, personally, I benefited greatly from that experience. It's still something I remember very, very clearly and vividly, even though it was over 20 years ago, because it was so exhilarating. And I learned a lot about life and, adventure, toughness, bravery, courage. But I'm also aware that those experiences can easily be hijacked and misused by other people to brainwash others into terrorism, etc. And we've seen that happen over and over again. In our minds, jihad was, in a very kind of old-fashioned romantic kind of way, inspired by films like The Message, really. The story of the Battle of Badr and Uhud, from the Prophet's time, where you have a good old honest straight fight and you either win or you die as the martyr trying. The thought of terrorism attacking innocent people or civilians, just attacking women and children or non-combatants, didn't even cross our minds. It wasn't even on the radar. That thought developed with Al-Qaeda in the late 90s, of course. And then after 9/11, of course, it went global. My journey, I was kind of grew up with Salafism and Islamism, and I think it's naturally kind of deepened into it and became one of its leaders in this country, especially on the campuses and things. But then my journey out of it has also been gradual, and there have been a number of experiences which led me away from those ideas and helped me broaden and deepen my understanding of Islam and its relationship to the modern world. I've learned so much more in the last 20 odd years since I was an 18, 19-year-old in every way, in terms of learning about the world, about religion, about Islam, in terms of experiences of life, getting married and having a family, having travelled abroad much more extensively, understood the politics and history, and so that your views on religion can't be so simplistic and can't be one size-fits-all solutions to people's very complex emotional and spiritual needs. So it's a very long, gradual process. Yeah. But one thing which is worth mentioning is a strong sense of revenge and rage, basically, and the strong sense of tribalism, of being a Muslim first and foremost, and the only thing that matters is our people, Muslims. We want to defend all Muslims. When you see news reports, when you saw Hollywood films, many of them in the 80s and 90s, which portrayed the terrorists as always Muslims, Arabic-speaking, this created a backlash, if you like, within us to say, well, we're going to get back at these people, if you like. And the sense of defeat is a very deep one, a very powerful one. And you could argue that the Muslim world, since the colonial invasion, has had a deep sense of defeat. And that sense of defeat and humiliation is a very powerful one. And I think, especially for young men, there's a real sense of hitting back. You want to win. There's a very strong tribalism, unfortunately, and that desire to defend your own people and to hit back against the perceived enemies. And I remember the Bosnian War, the videos coming out of there were very, very powerful. And of course, that's why thousands of British men went to fight in Bosnia, including some of our friends. All the major cults and gangs and terrorist groups, they misuse the idealism of young people and channel it into an unproductive way, because those people often simply don't know any better and are too weak to resist that. And therefore, the question of, can this be done in terms of deradicalisation? I am an optimist, and I do think we must try and attempt difficult conversations, such as the idea that, terrorists are human beings. Terrorists are made, not born. It is ideas and experiences which shape them into what they become, which includes violent, crazy killers. How do you focus and regain that little spark of humanity and goodness, which is in everyone? But human beings have an incredible capacity to delude themselves, as Sheikh Hamza says. And any psychologist, social worker, psychotherapist knows about that. People construct all kinds of worlds within their minds to remain within their comfort zones, to block out uncomfortable, difficult questions because they're too painful to deal with. It's a kind of well-known defense mechanism, actually, against difficult thoughts and painful conversations and memories and things. So they're difficult conversations, but I'm inspired by the examples of Northern Ireland, Rwanda more recently, Nelson Mandela, people like that, South Africa, to believe that it can be done.